In this video, I'm going to talk about how to rebuild this diesel high pressure fuel pump. This is a BMW E70 X5. It's a 3.0 SD with the M57 engine. This is a pretty common pump. It's made by Bosch. It's called a CP3. There are a bunch of different variants out there, but the basics of it pretty much stay the same across the board. So we're going to rebuild that. I've got a seal kit for that. The pump itself works perfectly okay. The problem with it is that I get leakage of fuel into the oil. I'm assuming through this seal here, so I'm going to rebuild the whole thing, put new seals in it, and hopefully that problem will go away. Access to the pump is a bit of a pain. It sits in here behind the timing case. The pump itself sits on 3 studs, and the way this works is I've got a tool in here that holds the sprocket in place. But there are 2 timing chains, one that comes from the lower one that comes from the crankshaft up to the pivot point on that pump, which sticks through here. There's a sprocket on that, and then a second chain goes up to the camshafts to drive those. To remove this, because the pump shaft itself is the thing that goes through the middle of the sprocket down behind here, so clearly that needs to stay in place. So there's a special tool which you'll need to get. And the way this works is this outer part here slots into the timing case. We've got this center part here, so when I remove, there's a nut on the end of the shaft of the pump, and then I've got the shaft sticking through, and what that center portion does is it slots in around, because the inside of the sprocket has a thread. Then that part there threads into the inside of that, so it holds it in place. So then I can go ahead and use this bit here, which then goes into the middle portion of that tool to push the pump out the other side. To get access to all of that requires a little bit of effort to start off with. The first thing, you'll need to remove the fan. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these procedures because there's plenty of videos out there to show you how to do that, but I'm just going to go through some stuff that is maybe worthwhile bringing up whilst I've got everything apart. So you'll need to remove the fan, you'll need to remove the intake manifold. There is a coolant pipe that sits over the top of everything here. This bit here slots in underneath the EGR cooler. The problem with that is that whilst it's got one of these simple clips like all the other connection points that you pull off, and then the thing just pulls straight out quite happily, the problem with it is it rotates out. It won't come out in that position there. So what that means is you'll need to drain the coolant, and you'll need to remove a couple of pipes here at the back so we can rotate this out. So I'll just show you how that fits in there. That goes in like that and then rotates around. And as you can see at the back here, there are 2 connection points here. That big one there, which is that pipe there, will need to be disconnected, so this one can come past that like that. And once you've removed those 2 connection points at the back, you can remove the 2 screws. There's another connection point here, that pipe there onto the EGR thermostat. They can get disconnected, and then once that's it, because I can pull that out, but I can't actually get it clear, and now that will rotate and come clean. Once we've done that, there's still going to be really busy out the back here. You've got the pipes for the fuel, which I'll talk about in a moment, but to get access to a reasonable amount of area, because it's pretty tight space, one thing I did was I disconnected the vacuum line there. There's just a single screw there that just pulls clear, and then you can rotate that around. That'll remove all of these vacuum lines out of the way. There's a whole bunch of these clips and stuff that you can disconnect, so to give you as much room as you possibly can. And then there are 3 studs that the pump sits on at the back here. What that looks like, because that is up, so the connector for the pressure control valve, it points up. You've got the 2 connections for the fuel going in and out for the from the fuel tank, and also the return line to the fuel tank, as well as the high pressure outlet there, and then 3 studs that sits on it there, and there. So they're really embedded down. They take a 13mm socket. They're pretty hard to get out, especially those at the bottom here. I use a 13mm magnetic tool to remove those, and certainly getting those back on again is going to be pretty hard, because there's just very little room around here with all those lines and the side of the engine there. But they will need to come off. And then once they come off, then we can push the thing out with that tool from the front. When you disconnect the fuel lines, the black one there, the one that's braided, is the return line back to the pump. That just has a hose clamp on the end of it, so that can be removed. The clear one, which is the one from the fuel pump, from the fuel tank, the electric fuel pump, that has a banjo bolt on the end of it, which looks like that. So that will need to be removed, and I would suggest the moment you remove these, you immediately cover these. I use cling film all the time because you just unroll it, it's perfectly clean, cover it straight away, put a zip tie on it, because this is all downstream of the filter, the fuel filter, and if you get any grit or anything in here, that's going to be super bad because that'll just go straight into the injectors. The high pressure outlet is this hard pipe here, which comes up to the fuel rail. The problem with this is you can't take this out because of the gap in here and these big nuts on the end. You can't get that out, so that's going to stay in place there. And after I fit the pump later on, the last thing I'm going to do is thoroughly blow some solvent through this, make sure it's perfectly clean, and then just fit that straight away. But you'll need to disconnect both pipes. Obviously that's the one that connects to the pump. You have this one here which goes up to the fuel rail there. You can see, the moment I've disconnected that, I've immediately covered that in cling film so nothing can get inside there. Put a cable tie on there, and then I can just quickly remove that later on. To get access to the front here so we can put this tool in, there is a big cover that would be sitting in there that takes a 17mm Allen key. So you'll need to remove that, and then that nut there is the one that is on the end of the pump shaft, so that can be removed. Now when you try and turn that, that'll try and turn the engine over because that's connected to the timing chains. I just gave that a bit of a whack and that came off quite happily, but to torque that correctly you will need to hold the engine somehow so it doesn't turn over. They recommend using a tool onto the flywheel if it's an automatic, which this one is, through where the torque converter is. So you'll have to get under the car and have someone hold something in there, maybe a screwdriver if you don't have a specific tool, so you can torque that correctly on the way back in. But once that's removed, that comes off, then I can immediately fit my tool. The center portion, or the middle portion, just goes in finger tight, and then once I've cleared everything off the back here, I've got those two parts in, I can remove those three nuts off the studs that hold the pump in, and then I can put the center portion of the tool in and wind that in. It will push it out because it's conical, the shaft, it's really wedged in there. And so initially it'll take a fair bit of force and then it'll just go pop, and then it'll just push out very, very easily. To remove the belt, which you'll need to because it sits straight over the top of the access point to the front of the pump, you'll need to loosen the tensioner, which is that one there. Down the bottom there's a big 19mm hex, so you just put a big spanner on that, rotate it that way, that'll loosen the tensioner, and then you just move the belt off to the side, and then we get access to the front here and the cover. So this is the back of the timing case where the pump lives. There are two of the studs that it sits on. There's another one down the bottom. I've obviously just plugged that hole. Prior to installation, I would suggest plugging that hole like I've done that. Get some compressed air in here and clean up the face for where that gasket's going to go so you get a nice clean surface. There's going to be lots of gunk and stuff, which is pretty typical of this part of the engine, so you want to make sure that's plugged before you do that. Here's a bit of a closer look at the pump. That is the cover on the front, so that'll be sitting there like that, so that big 17mm Allen key to remove that. The sprocket that holds onto the two timing chains will be sitting around there. That's the nut that we need to remove. So once that's removed, the tool, that center portion of the tool will slide over there, lock into the sprocket, and then obviously we can push it from the outside. There'll be a gasket on the front there when you remove this, so that'll either be stuck to this or to the engine. Three nuts for those studs on the outside. A bit of a closer look at the connection points. That's the banjo point for the fuel line, that clear line that comes from the fuel tank, from the low pressure fuel pump. That's the return line there. They're pretty easily accessible, and you'll just need a long spanner to come down here and get hold of that one there, which is the outlet to that hard line that goes up to the fuel rail. To torque the nut on the front of the high pressure fuel pump, you'll need to hold the engine so it doesn't turn. Best way to do that I've found is, if you look through the gap here, up in here, there's about 1.5 inch square hole at the bottom of the bell housing. You can see the flywheel through there. Just get a screwdriver. You can easily just shove it in the side there and get someone to hold this in place whilst you torque the nut. To disassemble the pump for the rebuild, can't stress enough cleanliness. Clearly you need to have a spotless environment and ensure that just no grit or anything gets into the thing. Also, when you're pulling this apart, there are basically 3 pistons that run sort of like this in it, and what you want to do is keep all of those together, and they go back in exactly the same bores, and the face on the triangular piece, which you'll see in a moment, that moves around like this and actually drives the pistons up and down. You want to make sure that everything goes back into the same position, because clearly they have worn since new into that right spot. What I've done is for each of the corners there, you can see I've just used a Dremel tool. I'm not sure if you can see that, put a 1 there, so 1, 2 and 3. So everything that comes out of here is going to go into bucket number 1, etc. And then everything should go back in exactly the right spot. And I'll show you on the inside with the drive shaft and the bit that actually moves the pistons, what I've done there to ensure it goes back in the right spot. But once you've done that, then we can start to pull things apart. First thing we can do, and I've obviously just pulled all this apart before and everything's loose, you can just remove the 3 screws on the solenoid. Then that can just wiggle out. That is an O-ring in there that can be replaced. That's always going to be the first thing you take off and the last thing you put back on. And then to pull all of this apart, there are basically 2 parts here. There's the aluminium piece at the front and then the pump part at the back. There's a bunch of screws that hold it together. I would suggest putting this in a vise so that's held firmly, because these are on pretty easily, but you'll actually have to put a fair bit of force on these other things, and having it in a device makes it much, much easier. And then there are 6 screws here that we're going to remove. And then what we're going to do is separate these 2 bits. Now clearly I've already separated this because there are a couple of O-rings here that hold everything together. With that in a vise, you can just gently wiggle that back and forth. I've seen people shove screwdrivers in underneath here. I wouldn't do that because there's some mating faces on the other side where fluid flows from one side to the other. If you're going to use something, I would use a plastic pry tool, but eventually it will pop apart. And what you want to do is keep the shaft in this bit here. You don't want that to come out, so you need to push that down if required, if it starts to move up with it. And on the other side, when everything comes out, you'll have an O-ring in there, which you can replace. There's also one in there, and that's the one that's really sort of jammed down in here, which is holding that firmly in place, so you can replace that as well. In addition to that, there are 4 O-rings here that can also be replaced. Now, to remove the parts that are in this, again, you'll still need to have this in a vise. I would suggest, because you need to remove these pistons in here that move around, you can see I have marked on here just with some paint pen which one, so that one's going to number 1, 2, 3, etc. And then I'll show you what I've done, because that's probably going to wipe off when I clean the thing up. I've actually used a Dremel tool on the non-contact surface just to mark where number 1 is, so I don't get that mixed up later on. But before I pull these out, I would suggest removing these things at the end first, because this piston is going to move up and down. There are valve parts here and on the underside in there. So the fuel gets sucked in via these holes where that O-ring was there before. And there are lots of little parts in here that is really easy to lose track of if you pull this out first. So I would suggest removing these end caps off first. They're on really tightly, so they'll give a solid crack when they first start to move, and then they'll come out reasonably easily. And then once that comes out, there'll be an O-ring on the end of that plug. So this was number 3, so I'm going to put that in my number 3. And then on this side, there is a couple of parts here which are part of the valve here. So there's this bit on the outside there, and there's a little plunger on the inside. Don't lose that. I was scrambling around my shed floor for about half an hour trying to find the one that I lost. So we've got a little cap like that and a baby little thing like that goes in it, and the orientation of that is that when that goes in, you've got the flat side that goes down, you've got that little, that's the valve that allows fuel to go in, the flat side of that goes against the spring, and the little pin goes up into the hole there. And then we can remove the spring, and when we're going to install that, the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to put the spring in first. I'm going to put my little plunger, the little valve, put it on like that. Then that one is going over the top, ensuring that the little pin sits in there. And then I can put this over the top with a new O-ring and then tighten that down. And that was pretty tight. I reckon it's probably got a good 50 Newton meters or so on it. And so obviously there'll be 3 of those around the perimeter of the pump. And once you've removed the valve piece out of the end, go ahead and put the plug back in there, because what we're going to do is to remove these spring-loaded pistons, I'm going to use a clamp and I need something to hold against there. And then what you'll need to do is have 3 clamps, which I've just made up just out of rubbish old clamps that are lying around in the shed. 3-inch clamps work better. And the sizes of these, because what we're going to do is slot it down into that little gap there, so it's going hard against this part here, okay? Because that's the little piston, which we'll see in a moment, and that's what we're going to pull down. And the dimensions of that you can see, whilst that clamp was like that, you need to shave it pretty much hard line. It doesn't take that much force, so this doesn't have to be super strong. They're not going to be much good for anything else afterwards. But you'll need to cut all that off there, and I'll show you why in a moment. You'll need to cut off the ends here. The width of that needs to be less than 5 millimeters, and this needs to be about no more than 4 millimeters from there to there. And then that will slot into there like that, and then I can tighten that. And what that has done is now held that up here. So I'll tighten that all the way up, and you'll notice if I now rotate that piston around, it is holding that away. And now what I'm going to do is exactly the same thing for the other 2. And pull that rearwards, and now that's all nice and loose, and that thing can come out. Now you noticed before where I talked about the 1, 2 and 3 that I'd marked on those, that's just going to wipe off when I clean this. So what I've done, because this is a hardened face and this is the contact face here which is going to run against the tappet, so I'm clearly not going to mark that. So all I've done is used a Dremel tool and a little grinding wheel, and just put a little nick on either side to show me that that is number 1. And when I put number 1 in the right spot, that is clearly going to put all the others in the right spot as well. So that's the way that I've marked that. This doesn't touch anything, so it's perfectly safe to put a mark on that. And now I can undo each of these. And what's going to come out is we're going to have, firstly, the tappet itself. So this is number 2. And then you're going to have, these are very, very tight fit, these. You have the spring and the piston itself. So when you're pulling up with the clamp, you're pulling up on that edge there. And so when that goes back in, you're going to fit the spring in first, and then put this in. Now these are really tight. They're not tight, they're just a very fine fit, so you'll need to wiggle it back and forth until it eventually goes in. And then once it goes in, it's just going to move up and down quite nicely. The tappet will go over the top, like that. You obviously compress that, but then to put everything back in place again, I am going to put my clamp on there like that, and then tighten that and compress that all the way in, and do that for all three to be able to then put the shaft back in there again. And for reference for how this all fits together, there's the tappet on the inside, there's the piston that actually does the pumping. That would be sitting inside there, that spring would be in there like that. So that's what we're going to move from the inside. From the outside, that small spring fits against there, and then the flat side of that fits like that, and then that little plunger with the little thing sits in there, and that's the thing that goes over the end. When you remove this, have a look at all the contact faces, check that there's no scoring or damage or anything like that. And on the inside here for the bushing where that runs around, check that that's all in pretty good condition. And then we can start to remove the valves out of here. These are pretty simple. There's just a simple spring at the end of this little plug here, and then just a ball bearing. The outlet, because all these are joined, so one of these is the output that goes to the fuel rail. That had a fair bit of torque on it. I'm not sure what it would have been, but I reckon that probably would have been a good 50 Newton meters or so. But when you pull it out, you'll have a little spring on the end of that. That's number 2. And then for each of these, there'll be a ball bearing. Just get a magnetic tool, just grab that and pull it out. For each of these, instead of having an outlet, that's just a blank plug with the spring on the end of it. That's number 3. There are no O-rings on these. The base of the plug there, that ring there, seals down in the bottom. So these didn't have, I reckon they probably had about 30 Newton meters of torque on them. That was just my best guess because they came off more easily than the others. To remove the old shaft seal that's in there, that's stuck in there pretty well. And because it's quite narrow that way and quite deep there, it's not going to just pop straight out like with a screwdriver or something. The way I got this out was just using a punch tool on the inside at an angle, making sure you're really careful not to touch any of the inside part there. And what you're going to have to do is just gently tap it around a little bit at a time, and it'll eventually work its way out. Don't try and whack it out in one hit, otherwise it'll just sort of punch straight through the steel a little bit at a time, and it'll come out quite nicely. For the seal at the front here, I fitted that after I'd put on the 2 pieces and joined them together. I found that was easier, so I could then just lube up the shaft and the outside of the seal, slide it over the top of it, and I tried using a wide socket, but it wanted to go in a little bit at a funny angle, so I found it was easier just to use something just to tap that in as I went around the edges, and that was an easier way of getting that to go in more evenly. So here is the pump after the rebuild. A couple of things that might help you out. Make sure as you're putting all the parts together, obviously everything needs to be spotlessly clean. Put a drop of oil on all the moving parts. So the pistons, when you're fitting them, etc., make sure they move nice and smoothly, etc. So you don't have any metal on metal contact anywhere as you're putting anything together. The outlet lines, the one I thought the banjo bolt was the one that came from the pump in the fuel tank. It's not, it's actually that one there. I've just plugged some Glad wrap in there. That's the return line that goes back to the fuel pump. This is the high pressure line here. As you can see, I've just covered that. That's going to sit like that in the engine once it's installed, so it's going to be easy to cut off and plug that one relatively easily and just pull that one out. This one here, which is buried down, I put a cable tie around that, and I can just untwist that off and turn that off when I'm ready to go. So everything's nice and sealed and clean, so you're not going to get any debris inside. When you put everything back together again, constantly be checking. This should just move perfectly smoothly with no grinding or impedance to it at all. The kit that I used was this one here. It's made by Meat & Doria, which is an Italian company that makes kits and a whole bunch of replacement parts. As you can see, there's a whole bunch left over because from what I've seen online, A lot of pumps have sort of looks like another gear-driven pump on the back of it here. So there's a shaft that comes out of the back. So there's extra seals, etc. And this is just a generic kit. This doesn't have that. All I replaced were these bits here. So I've got the seal that was there, the two big ones in the middle, the three that go on the outside here, the four green ones that go in between the two pieces, the three ball bearings which are on the valves on the inside there, as well as the two that are on the snout for the control valve. What was interesting is that all the videos that I'd seen online, the valves that are at this end here, are completely different to what I had seen other videos of. These valves, as you saw, are a whole bunch of different parts that you have to put together. The ones I'd seen online, the valve at this end is just a single piece that just gets bolted on with the cap at the end, which is obviously a lot simpler. Maybe that's a later design, because this is a bit fiddly and it's easy to lose stuff, so just be careful. To bleed the system, once everything is fitted, come into ISTA. Where you want to go to is Vehicle Management, then Service Functions, then open up, I hit the plusness, DDE, then down to bleeding the fuel system, then there's one here on the right, bleeding the fuel system, hit display, and basically it says it's going to operate the electric fuel pump in the fuel tank. You'll hear a few noises and that sort of thing. It says the activation must last for at least 3 minutes. Now it'll sit there and just keep on going over and over again, but people recommend that you do this multiple times. So I'm going to do it for 3 minutes and then go back, because after 3 minutes it says try to start the car, and so you can hit back, so the button over. So to go backwards, instead of continue over on the right hand side, you come over here, hit back, and then start the process again. Do that multiple times, and then you might still need to crank the engine multiple times to get the thing to go. So hit continue. As you can see there, it just says system active, and now you'll start to hear noises and stuff from the back of the car as it starts to bleed things, and then continue to end the activation. So I can hear some hissing and stuff from the back of the car. And then once I have this done for at least 3 minutes, if I continue, it'll ask to again start the car. I'm going to hit back on the left and do this over and over again. So I've done it 3 times for 3 minutes. It says must be in park and secured, which it is. Click continue, and it says start the car. And what it's going to do is it's going to do some funny stuff just to increase the rail pressure to hopefully get all the air out of the system. Let's see if she starts. There you go, she started. How good. So after I started the car and it started okay, then I hit continue and it immediately pumps the RPM up to 2000 RPM. It says run it like this for at least 10 minutes to bleed the system completely. So that's what I'm doing now. So it's been running at the raised RPM for about 10 minutes now, so I'm just going to continue. And it says that's the bleeding procedure completed. The engine seems to be working perfectly, and turn off the engine. I would suggest when you are just about to do the bleeding process and get the engine started for the first time, leave the covers off, leave the noise insulation off as well. Gives you good access to be able to have a look at everything once the car's started, just to shine a torch down here and have a good look, check that there's no leaks. Also, it allows you, without the noise insulation here, to get your eyes in here and have a look at that main fuel connection point that actually goes down to the high pressure fuel pump to check that you've got no leaks there as well.